Thanks everyone for being here today. My name is Julia Wester. As you can tell, I sound pretty American, but I recently just moved to Sweden in July for family reasons and all that. But I live 2 train stops south in Svedala, and I own a little consultancy called 55 Degrees AB. So I do a little bit of consulting, coaching, training, etc. But I'm here to talk about one of my favorite things to talk about, and that's management. And we've been hearing a lot about management in different kinds of ways, and so some of those you're going to hear things repeated, some things you might hear are different. But I want to start out first by finding out who came to this talk because they're a manager and they want to know why they can convince people that they should keep their jobs, right? Okay, so we got a few of those. Okay, what about, are you a person that came here because you want to find out, is there really any value in these people that just irritate the crap out of me? Any of those kind of people? Okay, so we've got our work cut out for us here. Perfect, okay. So, this is a picture of one of my favorite kinds of groups to be in, a lean coffee meeting. Okay, I think you used to have one here. Maybe I'll start one up because I don't think there is one anymore. But this is from Seattle, where I just moved from. And this is where I started hearing this topic. Let's get rid of all the managers. Sometimes it was even violent. Let's kill all the managers. Right, that's a little crazy, but. So, you know, we would have these conversations, and they kept popping up in different kinds of meetup groups. And then I started seeing it in the media. Not just, you know, trash magazines, but HBR, Forbes, Inc., serious places talking about the value of managers, and it seemed like the consensus was growing that there just wasn't any, right? Well, I guess now's the time I should confess that I was a manager. So I really wanted to figure out what the heck was going on. I don't know quite yet how it is here. I hope to learn more about Swedish business culture. But in the US, people wrap their identities up in what they do. So you're at work so long, you know, people want to know about you and you immediately start telling them what you do for work, right? It's your identity. So I was a manager. I had started out managing a large website called NBA.com, the web developers for that team. Did that for a few years. We did great work, so I'm like, let's do that again. Moved to Seattle from Atlanta and managed a web team at F5 Networks. And then I got out of management for a little bit and went to a Kanban tool company called LeanKit. Tried to stay away from management a little bit and fell back into that. So, I mean, I think it's time for me to face it, that I'm just management material, right? That's what I'm going to be doing. So the question was, if people were trying to get rid of people like me, you know, was I part of the problem? And was I just completely unaware, not self-aware of what was going on? Was I thinking I was really great helping people succeed and they're looking at me like Dilbert's pointy-haired boss, right? That's what I really wanted to know. So I was a sad panda, you know. One thing that I wanted to understand is, how did we get here? You know, we obviously have a serious problem going on. For me, when I have a problem, I want to go look back and figure out sometimes how it all gets started. So perhaps it's the history buff in me. And don't worry, I'm not going to give you a history lecture, so don't stress if that's not your jam. But we are going to talk about some highlights of history that may or may not have an impact on how we got to the problem that we're seeing today. So we're going to go all the way back to the late 19th century, to the birth of management as a discipline, and also the birth of management consultants with Frederick Winslow Taylor. So you can blame him for people like me, I guess. But Principles of Scientific Management. This was a paper published in the early 20th century that tells us what he was trying to solve when he started this management as a discipline. Okay, he was a mechanical engineer, and he had seen lots of things going on, and he thought it just could be done better. That's why he started looking into this at all. So the problem that he was trying to solve was wasted time. Whenever he looked around, it was rampant. And the types of wasted time he saw were loafing or soldiering. And what he means by this can be summed up in sort of 2 different ways. He thought that we had a natural tendency to waste time or loaf around. We wanted to take it easy. So there was this natural kind of soldiering that we had going on. And then also there was a social kind of soldiering that would happen. And it's sometimes hard to really know when you're experiencing this. That it can be best summed up for one of my mom's experiences. She can't sit down. She's always doing something, always working. And she started this job in a government agency in the US, and someone came up to her and said, "You're really gonna have to slow down. You're making us all look bad." Right? So that's the other kind of soldiering that he was talking about, the social pressure from the people around you to normalize what's going on so that you're not ostracized and they don't look bad. So whether or not that's what really happens a lot, that's what he thought he was seeing, and he was working in a lot of manual laboring spaces. So we had that. Then he saw lots of people not suited for the job. When people are, lifting heavy iron, if you're not really strong, maybe you're not quite as suited for that job as someone who's really bulked up. And then he saw jobs being done inefficiently. He could see from his sort of distance sitting back how different people were doing the work and could see the differences in how that work was being done, and discerned maybe there is a way that if some people did it slightly like other people, then we'd get a lot more efficiency. So those are the problems he was trying to solve at that time. So he came up with this idea of scientific management, and there are 4 principles. And I'm going to apologize to the ladies in the room. I took this directly from the paper, which was written in the age of the man, right? This is way back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So this really was just all men working. So the first principle was, develop a science for each element of a man's work, which sort of replaces the, oh yeah, I think I'm going to do it that way. And this other person's like, I sort of like doing it this way. So he did a lot of time and motion studies that he watched a lot of people do different things, and they came up with a specific, exact way to do a thing, and then they wrote it down, okay? So you could say that's sort of the birth of standard work, in a way. Then what he wanted to do was fix one of the other problems and scientifically select the right people for the right job. I mean, so far it doesn't seem too crazy, right? And this was different than the past. And not only did, they just throw bodies at things, I guess, is what his perspective was, is that there wasn't a lot of training going on. So they put some rigor into how to do it, put some rigor into who should do it, and then they put rigor into training people to be able to do it the right way. So lots of good things happening. The next bit was to cooperate, and this means between management and the workmen, to cooperate to ensure all the work was being done in specifically the way that the science said it was the best way to do it, and in the time they thought it should take you to do it, right? And what's interesting to note here is that if you were able to do it, if you were able to meet your quotas, your targets, you got a 30 to 100% bonus of your monetary salary. So you had monetary incentives. And then this is an interesting part. The management take over all of the work that they are better fitted for, and the workmen take over the part that they are best fitted for. Now, I have to say, when I read documents, I try to take into account the time and place where they were written, because it's really difficult to judge something written 200 years ago with our values and standards today. But I do have to say it's still a little bit, when you read a little bit about the thought that he had about some of the workmen. Comparing strong people to oxes, so they possibly couldn't understand the way that, the science that goes into figuring out the right way to do things. So there's some good and there's some bad in this one. He built sort of a management class versus a worker class, right? But he also said that there's a shared responsibility between these two groups of people to have the outcomes we desire. So even though sometimes it seems like he didn't think very highly of people, he still wanted them to have good conditions, be able to do the work, and share the responsibility with them for the outcomes. So these are the 4 principles of science, scientific management specifically. So we already talked a little bit about how number 4 sort of iffy, and a lot of times we take number 3 and replace cooperate with ensure, right? And we put lots of micromanagement and punishment on that, but that's not necessarily how that was intended, which we'll get to shortly. So despite whatever we think, and we often give Taylor quite a hard time about his role in our issues today, it really does take 2 to tango in this situation. In his paper, he said, the employer can't really be prosperous if both the employee and the employer feel that prosperity. Okay, you can't just beat the workers and have a prosperous company for ages on end. Okay, so that's a little bit about the original, how we got here. But as early as the 1920s and 30s, we were rethinking motivation. Elton Mayo in the Hawthorne studies, this was at the Western Electric Company, they started to have hypotheses about what really motivated people. And we had been thinking that people were motivated by monetary incentives and by good working conditions, and we can all agree those are good things. But what happened is they ran some experiments and followed up with surveys and things, and they introduced monetary incentives, and they introduced good working conditions, but then they also introduced other things, like having a more group type of belonging type of group to be in, teamwork, and gave people more social improvements than they had in the past, so they could be involved in decision making, et cetera. And then after a while, they started to see improvements in outcomes, and they took away the monetary and physical improvements, and the outcomes still stayed high. So what they took away from this is that belonging to a group and being involved in decision making is is better or gives us a better incentive than monetary incentives and physical working conditions. I mean, assuming that you have a stable place to live and all of that. This, by the way, is the beginning of the human relations, the HR, human resources movement. In the 1940s, we started rethinking decision making. I still work with teams and organizations to help them understand the value of distributing their decision making. We've heard talks here about the importance of that. How many people in this group here think their organization effectively lets you make the decisions you're best suited to make? Okay, so less than half, maybe close to half. We knew this stuff 80 years ago, and we're still having trouble understanding that in order to create value for customers, that we have to let the people who are closest to the customer make the right decisions. Okay? In the 50s, we started rethinking relationships in the workplace. We started hearing from Peter Drucker, who is considered the father of modern management. And he said organizations should be seen as human communities, built on trust and respect for the worker. I don't know about you, but I still, when I consult with teams and organizations, building psychological safety and trust and respect seems like new ground. But we knew all of this so long ago. So perhaps the problem with management is that we're just stuck way too far in the past. And we're trying to still catch up with science that's 80 years old, right? Or perhaps we're applying things to the wrong context. Maybe we take things like scientific management, which, perhaps work monetary incentives, as Bjarte Bognes said in his last presentation next door. He said, well, maybe this works when quality is less important than quantity and there's no motivation in the job. Perhaps we're trying to take things like that and apply them to the wrong types of situations. In fact, Taylor himself could see this coming. He said, and we talk about this all the time, well, that's not what Scrum was supposed to be. You're not doing it right. That's not what this was supposed to be. Because a lot of times we take the practice and we just start applying it like crazy because it sounds pretty easy, but we don't really understand why that practice worked in the first place and why we should be using it. And he knew that the same thing would happen with the things that he was coming up with in the late 1800s. So it will lead to failure and disaster if you're not using it with the underlying principles. So ending our history lesson, why does this matter? Can't we just get rid of all the managers and then we don't have to worry about all this crap, right? Why? Well, it's pretty simple. Our engagement, employee engagement in organizations is dismal, okay? I have been studying the State of the American Manager report and now the Global Workplace report by Gallup. It's one of the biggest research groups on this topic. I thought the US was bad at 31%, but then I looked at Western Europe and it's 10% of workers are engaged at work. There's almost twice as many that are actively disengaged, actively trying to do something nefarious in the workplace, and then 71% of people who just like, right? And when we have 90% of employees that are or actively trying to do something wrong, then our businesses are not going to thrive the way we want them to. And these studies go into all the specific details of what's driven by employee engagement. But why does management matter? Well, because managers account for at least 70% of the variance in employee engagement scores across organizations and within organizations. I can't remember which person said it in a talk I went to here, but it's not enough to work for a good company. You can work for a great company and have a really crappy experience, right? And again, why does it matter? Couldn't we just get rid of all of the managers and then, it would be awesome? But that variance goes both ways. Good managers can either make or break your experience. They can disengage you or they can motivate you to be highly engaged. So we need managers that understand the best way is to motivate people, because whether or not they know it, they're making an impact on the organization. We've heard a lot of Deming over this conference, at least a few times. But he says that people are already doing their best, and this, by the way, includes managers, right? We had a number of people in the room who self-identified as a manager. How many of those people also have managers? If you're a manager and you have a manager, right? So not only are employees disengaged, you can go to these studies and look at how disengaged the managers are, because they're not being properly trained and motivated, and you can see this vicious cycle happening. But what's interesting is their problem is a system problem, and managers are placed in the spaces between parts of our system, and they have a unique ability to see what's going on and a unique ability to alter the system so that the problems change or improve. So what I want to do is start with, and I won't just let you hear from me, but I want to start with 6 things that helped me become a manager that I think people valued. Now, I did go back and I checked with people that had been in my teams before to make sure I just wasn't full of hot air. And this information came from a joint discussion between people that had been on teams before with me. Number 1, ignore hierarchy and be part of a team. This is really crucial. It's the underpinning of a lot of other things. I, as a manager, had a job to do. And when you have a job to do, you need feedback on how well or poorly you're doing that job. The sad part is that my place on a hierarchical organization was the very thing that prohibited me getting the feedback that I needed. Right? People were going to tell me what I wanted to hear because I could control their salaries, their bonuses, their time off, There are, all of these other things that could impact them. They would tell me what I want to hear. So I had to take active steps to push away the positional power and have real conversations with my team, and they would go something like this. I'm a person with a job to do, just like you. It's not better or more important than yours, it's just different. So we're going to have to figure out a way to work together so that you can feel safe giving me the feedback that I need so I can do a better job in my role, and I'll do the same for you. So I knew that this was working when you have to say this stuff over and over and over again, and then you have to really mean it. You can't just say it and then do punishing things to the side and expect people to tell you what you really need to hear. But when I had a senior developer walk into my office one day, and he said, that decision that you're making on this thing, it's wrong. It's really wrong. And here's why I think so. I'm like, yes, we're finally winning. We're moving in this area. So for me, it was something that I always had to be cognizant of and always push it to the side. And again, these are not mind-breaking, extremely difficult things to do. They're very achievable. The second one is to be approachable and available. Now, I don't even know about you, but at times being a manager feels like your role should really say professional meeting attendee, because your calendar is packed with meetings all day long. That doesn't leave a lot of time for working with and helping your employees, the people that supposedly report to you on the org chart. And so that translates to canceled one-on-ones, moved one-on-ones, all of this other stuff. That tells me as an employee that I'm not as important as all this other stuff. So one of the first things that we need to do is start flipping that around and understanding what's really important, making the facilitating and empowering your employees, the things that you do for that being the most important. And if the other stuff can't fit around that, you don't have enough time for it, right? Now, why is this really important? Because the studies from the State of the American Manager Report from Gallup says that employees whose managers are more open and approachable are more engaged. And what's really interesting is that this is not just about work stuff. It's not just about the project or the thing that they have to do. It's about non-work related issues, any types of questions they have. Now, this makes sense when you think about it, because when you walk into the door at work, you can't just leave at the door the fact that your dog was sick or you had a fight with your spouse or something's happening and something's going on. You bring your real life with you into the office. Now, you might not just go unload on your boss all the time or whatever, but managers need to understand they work with whole people, and they need to be able to help people or tell them where they can go for different assistance so that they can focus and do the best work during the day. Now, again, knowing that this was working for me was when I would have a lot of, we all have really great people working in our teams. And so they would come in and they would say, well, I don't really have a lot to talk about, so this one-on-one will be pretty short. And then we ended up going overtime often because we would just start talking. I would ask open-ended questions, and we would start communicating, and that built a better relationship, so when we did have a problem, we could talk about it better. Okay. Third. Now, I might get some eye rolls in the audience. I really have a trigger word when we call people resources. Does anyone else give a crap about that? Okay. Now, I never did the swear jar thing, but I happen to think it's a really good idea that if you put a swear jar on your desk and every time you call a person a resource, you have to put a few crowns in it, and then if you're unlucky enough to amass some cash, you could spend it on the people that you called resources. But here's the thing. I feel like, and this is at least just me, that when we call people resources, it's an act of dehumanization a little bit. And that tiny little psychological shift allows us to do things we might not otherwise do to people that we know and care about. So when we treat them like pawns and move them here and there and split them and do all these things, I'd rather force myself to think about the actual people and whatnot that I'm dealing with. So that's a little thing. Sometimes words matter. Number 4, foster cognitive safety or psychological safety, both different ways to talk about this. The first thing is to actually even know that this is a thing as a manager, that we're not just worried about physical safety and where the fire exits are and all of that, that we have to care about and understand what impacts our mental ability to do good work. And that could be things ranging from, you're yelling at people, which is not good, all the way to the code base is so terrible that it makes people not even want to come to work. These are all different variations of cognitive safety. Now, Joshua Karyevsky, who some of you may know from the modern agile movement, when I first started hearing him talk, it was a lot about psychological safety or cognitive safety. And so he handed out these little cards one time, and they are called Stop Work Authority cards. Okay? And so people at his organization had these little cards, and it reminded them that they have the authority to stop work when something dangerous is happening. Not just physical danger, but mental danger. Okay? Hey, working every weekend, to get this project out the door, stop. That's not going to work. Here's all the ways it's going to go wrong. Or, fill in the blank with whatever. Then on the other side, it reminds us that we're an engineer, which lean people like Japanese words. I don't know what to say. But it basically reminds us that we are responsible for our company's safety culture, that it takes all of us to make that happen. And so it just reminds us of all the different things that we are responsible for, not just our safety, but others and whatnot. So knowing that this is a thing and having perhaps even tangible reminders that we can and we should care about this is helpful. Okay, who loves a good micromanager? Anyone? Okay, we got one. Brave. Okay. Now, I think about myself when I tend to want to micromanage, it's because I'm scared of something or I don't know what to do, so I try to over-control the situation. I get more detailed. But we hire really smart people, and we don't need to be scared so much. So we have to think of a way to make it safe to let other people make decisions like we learned was necessary in the 1940s. Maybe the reason that we haven't done it is because we haven't really thought about all the safe ways to do that. Not just safe for me to let go and let other people make the decision, but safe for them to make those decisions and not get punished for doing it. Now, I picked this picture on purpose because the concept of a guardrail is very important. It's a good kind of mental concept. Okay? So we want to set up guardrails, and one of the ways that we can do that is with a back briefing process. So this sort of comes from the military, and I'm not going to talk about this template very much, but this is like an A3 template you can use for helping you think through the briefing and back briefing process, which is a tool to help you distribute decision making. Okay? And what it does is it helps us not only extremely be clear about what we're trying to achieve and what led us to want to achieve this. It also helps us make our goals. What should happen if we do this thing? What's the outcome that we see? So it's not like implement this software project. That's not a goal. That's a way to get to a goal. So if we do this, what do we see happen from that? And then over here in the boundaries area, this is the crucial part of distributing decision-making safely. What are the boundaries, the guardrails, the constraints? So you have freedom to make choices in this area. I know these things already, so I'm going to help you out with letting you know it's safe to choose whatever open source projects you want to use. It's safe to spend up to this much money, whatever. Or on the other hand, what are the constraints that I already know about? You can't hire any more people. You have to use the same tech stack. Whatever, right? The way we get autonomy is to set up guardrails to make it safe for people to operate in those boundaries. It's not like some people think where you can just decide whatever you want. We all have boundaries and constraints. And then once we give people this information, we're not going to be perfect the first time. So if we say, here's your boundaries, And something goes wrong. Well, it might be more because I didn't know about a constraint I needed to set. So I'm not going to punish people for making decisions within the boundaries that I had given them. It's going to be hard. I'm going to want to do it, but I'm not going to do it because the only thing that will do is make people not make decisions in the future when I really need them to, because that's the only way to scale. I cannot make all the decisions, okay? And then once you give people that information, you can't run away, but you also don't need to be in their business all the time. So you sort of need to stay a safe distance back, be visible, but be out of the way, and talk often. Okay, the last tip from me is to measure what matters. So my thought about this is that what you measure tells people what you value. And a lot of times, if we just measure things and we don't know why we're measuring it, we're causing more problems than we're solving. Let me explain why. Eli Goldratt has a quote, says, "Tell me how you'll measure me and I'll tell you how I'll behave." Because he knows that measurements drive behaviors, okay? And he says, if you measure me in an illogical way, don't complain about my illogical behavior, right? Because you just told me to do that because of the way that you're measuring me, right? So everything we measure drives a behavior or set of behaviors. So we need to measure what matters or not measure it at all. We really need to understand why we're measuring something and what behaviors we might drive. So I've heard a lot of talks about teams versus individuals, or a lot of points in talks. I love this image because it feels like I'm looking at a team, and everyone's being measured on their individual value, or the individual productivity or whatever. So there's a clear winner, which makes sense if you want to incentivize individual behavior. But most of us work in teams. So this will only breed discontent and competition, which isn't necessarily healthy for what we're trying to achieve. So I need to be really smart about what my metrics are doing to people's behaviors. And this is one of the things that Deming meant when he said managers can change the system. Because we create systemic conditions that drive behaviors with things like this that we do. So we have a lot of power, and sometimes we don't even know the impacts we're causing. So those are some of my thoughts, but you don't have to just take it from me. You can listen to Google. So Google seems to be known for not ever believing what people say and figuring stuff out for themselves. In 2002, they decided, yeah, we don't think managers matter either, so let's just dump them all. And they went to a completely flat organization structure. But just a few short months later, they brought the managers back because they found out that people weren't getting answers to specific questions that they needed, and they weren't getting guidance in critical areas such as career advice. So it's not that managers are bad or unnecessary, it's that we need to train them on how to do their work well and point them in the right directions and help them understand the impacts of their decisions. In 2008, they said, we're still not convinced that managers are good. So they did Project Oxygen, which turned out to be a multi-year research study that ended up not only proving that managers were useful, but that they had positive impact and that they increased things like job satisfaction and retention. In fact, they came out with a list of the top 8 behaviors of a good manager at Google. So don't take this and say, this is what a good manager. This is good manager at Google, okay? And in fact, on their website Rework, you can take the surveys and find out what makes a good manager at your work. So I'm not going to go over all of this because you can read, and this is online. But the thing that I want to point out is that probably to a person, everyone you asked before the survey would have said, we need deep technical expertise. If not deeper than the people who work on the team, that's what's most important to be a manager. That's what they thought would come out of this. It was important to have technical understanding, but it was the least important thing that came out of all of this. You can trust your people on your team to know how to do this. You need to advise them, poke holes in theories, make them think, but they can't do all of these other things for you. So you might be thinking, that's like 11 years ago. That's so last decade. Well, they checked again, and they've been checking continuously, and they found out that managers do still matter at Google. They help set strategic direction, and a lot of the other ways that managers are valuable, they still are. And so they updated their list. And you'll notice that not a whole ton has changed. There's 10 instead of 8. So the 2 at the bottom in green are new. And the 2 in blue are worded slightly better to be clearer and really come across the point that, of the behavior that they wanted to happen. And technical skills are still there, and they're still not the most important thing. Okay, so there's one last stat and tip that I want to give you before closing that I think most of us don't realize is important. And that is that we need to focus on bolstering the strengths of our employees. Now, when we hear that, we think so binary all the time. What do you mean I can't tell people what they're doing wrong or that they need to get better? That's crazy. We need to tell people how they get better. Well, of course we do. But I said focus on, not only do. So we need to let people know their opportunities for improvements, but by far and away, we need to mostly focus on what they do well, strengthen that, and make that more relevant in our organizations. Help them be more impactful. And you can see that the more that the managers do that, the higher it correlates to employee engagement. Okay. And the more that we focus on negative characteristics, that the engagement goes down. And one of the reasons why that is important is, again, because it's not something super difficult to do. It makes a huge impact, and a lot of us don't know that that's a real problem, right? You think, oh, of course they know what they're good at. But we need to keep telling people, you're good at this, you're good at this, here's how you can use that in our organization. Let me find more ways for you to improve our organization with the things that you're good at. So I want to close with my favorite quote in this domain. Yes, even the guy, if you were in Bjarte's talk right before this is the same guy that said, I'm going to paraphrase, that management is essentially about making everything more difficult for the employees, right? It's because of all the things that we do. But that didn't mean he really thought management was bad. It was just how we were doing it he thought was detrimental. So here's what he really thinks about management. That management is about human beings. Hard to argue with, right? Its task is to make people capable of joint performance, of working together. It takes a specific set of skills to be able to do that. And then our job as managers is to make these people, these groups of people, to make their strengths effective and their weaknesses irrelevant. And so I think as long as we need these things, as long as we need joint performance in organizations, then the role of manager can still be valuable. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. You can see I've got a bunch of ways you can keep in touch with me. There's about 1,000 things I wanted to say and didn't have time, so you can, if this is your jam, you can geek out with me on the webs after this, or I'll be here for a couple more hours. But thank you so much, and I'm around during lunch if you have any questions. I don't want to keep you from the line. I know it's already formed, but thank you.